Welcome back to Night School, episode 29, the poems of Emily Dickinson, part 7. And back with me is my esteemed colleague, Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back, Mr. Schantz.
Hey, it's good to be back. Finishing up Emily Dickinson's poems, at least those recommended by the Poetry Foundation 101 page.
Yeah, looking forward to doing this quite a bit. And just now sharing my screen and looking at that page, it looks like the two we're doing today are Because I Could Not Stop for Death, 479, and I'm Not Admitting of the Wound, 1188. And so, well, especially in this bleak January weather, even here in San Diego, I'm looking forward to talking about death with you today, Mr. Wesley Schantz. And so, as usual, I noticed that the Poetry Foundation here insults us by giving us a reading, not thinking that we wouldn't provide the wings to these words ourselves. Just kidding, of course. But is it your turn to read or is it mine?
Couldn't tell you. I think that I might have read the last one, but I don't remember now. Gosh.
I think that's true because I recall, and this is a funny way to have recalled it, but I recall that it had more hyphens or dashes, and that the one that I had read had fewer dashes. And so, yeah, I'll read this one. Because I could not stop for death, 479. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held out but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice and the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity.
That is a famous one. I didn't know that they passed by the school. That's rather curious. And the kids in the ring, that I wonder what they're playing there, or rather striving after.
Ring around the rosy, pockets full.
That's what
Posy, ashes, they all fall down. Yeah, the setting sun right after that too, yeah.
Yeah, right. That's what I imagined, a singing kind of game. And it's a kind of sing-song rhythm to this. And it's a kind of school also, I think, where she's sort of schooling herself in preparing herself for death or sort of coming to terms with it maybe. But the other thing, the grain, fits that as well, being like ready for the harvest sort of image.
Reaping. Yes, the great reaping.
And let's see, the image again is of a motion, like we saw the frigate and the chariot with the book. This time it's death with his carriage. And the carriage doesn't hold just her in death, but also immortality. So that's like the close of the first stanza. And then the close of the last, of course, is eternity. And that's what the horses' heads are pointed towards, it seems like. So I think we talked a bit about this before when she was talking about fame and sort of the role of poetry. We've discussed a bit. I wonder what her distinction here is, that the carriage holds immortality and it heads toward eternity. It seems like those are really very different places. Like immortality would be something for her, like in the world perhaps, or of her soul, right? Her existence as a subject. Whereas eternity seems like something a bit more cosmic, a bit more impersonal maybe, even perhaps more mysterious, right? It can't be bound in the carriage the same way. Of course, death is personified here to an extent. He's like the driver, I suppose. which is, traditional, that traditional association with harvest, again, is implied. But he's also, I guess, quite decorous, right? He has no haste. Um, she has to put on her best sort of business manner, and sort of just let everything else go. And then there's this kind of turn after the setting sun there. Um, the sun passed them by, right? And the night falls on them. And then we get these more kind of earthy images of gossamer, of tulle. I guess it's a kind of material. I'm not sure what a tippet is. Guessing some kind of garment. I'm not sure. But then, the impression is that they're sort of, underground, actually, the house, right? The site of, her resting place seems like what we've got here. And that's like reinforced by the rhyme of ground and ground. It doesn't get much, much more perfect of a rhyme than that. Like, we've been talking, at times she's quite loose or slanty with her rhymes, like ring and sun there. But here you've got the most perfect rhyme imaginable, the same word. And the close of the poem, again, contrasting times, sort of the mystery of time is unfolded there. Centuries, days, and eternity are put into juxtaposition, and you rhyme day with eternity, which is a really cool, although not terribly euphonious rhyme. And it sort of sounds like some old hymns. I forget which one. Maybe it's Amazing Grace, where they talk about, like, in one of the stanzas of that hymn, they're talking about how long they've been singing, in the celestial choirs, and it's like, their sense of time, which I think is true when you sing or when you're in a poetic sort of mode. Your sense of time is really different, and you do sort of point towards at least eternity that way. I don't know how religious to make this poem out to be, honestly, but it's certainly sort of teleological in that deep sense. I don't know. What do you make of it?
Well, it's a very tough poem, and there was something that was said by Nassim Taleb in The Black Swan, which I'm just about to finish, where he describes the opinion of another scholar on Emily Dickinson being that her poems are supposedly recursive, and that they have a fractal nature. And what a fractal is a recursive system, and what a recursive system is a system of recurring patterns that reiterate each other. And so we've seen that often in her structure, right? The quatrain, and the quatrain doing differing things with it. And so there's a similarity and a difference between many of the poems that we've had access to. And we see, again, now these dashes, they're shorter than usual, that are going on. And we see a lot of, you were talking about images of the school and of her and her personal relationship with death. We get all these second person pronouns, we, our. It's interesting too, just because it recalls to me also just the language of Dante in the middle of our life. I found myself in a dark wood, and the carriage held but just ourselves, as if there is in this second personness a sharing, a general aspect of human nature, which of course here is the fact that we all die. And so what is immortality? And what does immortality look like for us? Because it seems to be something we can't conceptualize. We know what it is to rise, we know what it is to fall, but what does it mean to be forever? And there seems to be a tension, I think, like you noticed. There doesn't seem to be a lot of religious imagery going on, except for that great harvest imagery you were talking about, the great reaping. That's why the grim reaper has a scythe. And Kronos was known to have a scythe. Kronos, like time, though Carl Carini claims that's an incorrect etymology. It's pretty much accepted. And passing the school, yeah, it almost as if it's everywhere. I wonder also if it if it's being learned about in the school, or if it actually, passes through the school and something horrible happens, and that's how death is in its ubiquity. But also, before I engage with your eternity immortality question, it's just, do you see the penultimate stanza, the house that seemed a swelling of the ground, the roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground? Is that a grave? Is that like a small bump of earth where somebody has been buried?
Yeah, I was taking that to be her grave,
Yeah.
actually. But I guess if
Yes.
they passed it, uh, an ornamental molding around the wall of a room.
Yeah.
So it's actually like a part of the wall, I suppose, which again sort of like suggests that this place, this is going to be like a container for something, right? But in the ground, and like I said, that like that emphasis on the the swelling of the ground, I suppose that could be something you see from outside of it. The cornice, the very top of it, is still in the ground, and so it's I think a pretty clear like underworld sort of image that we're getting there.
Right, right. As if she is being drawn down. And just to add to your interpretation about the carriage and death in the carriage, of course, a very famous image from Greek mythology, which I had the chance to talk about in context of Odysseus meeting Nausicaa today, and initiation rituals and female initiation rituals and the literature on that, was the rape of Persephone by Hades, the god of the underworld, who takes her down, who takes her from a maiden picking flowers to a flower picked, to becoming a wife. And it seems to be an initiation ritual indicating that the life of a married woman who is often a mom is very different from the life of a child, which I think probably every mother would agree with quite a bit. And so we have that image here too of her being carried down into the next area of life in this sort of psychopomp way. And there seems to be some degree of acceptance of this. I'm not sure exactly what to do with the last stanza. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than a day. Is this her standing outside herself in the time after her death, and that she is incapable of perceiving what happens afterwards? I'm not sure. That's the last bit that I'm struggling with.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the idea, right? It's like her ability to imagine this whole process concludes with her ability to imagine looking back on the process somehow.
Yes, a retrospective.
And there's a lot of elision, not only just the word tis, which is nice and archaic, it's the elision of it is, right? But also the word it should really be there between yet and feels, but it's not, and you don't need it. Like it's understood, I suppose. So it's doubly elided, the word it, first into tis, and then out of the phrase entirely, out of the clause, and yet feels. So it's just sort of gone, whatever it is, that sort of dummy word that we use to talk about the passage of time. And so in the last couplet there too, I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Were what toward eternity, right? Like they were, the verb is implied, like, pointed toward or directed toward. But the verb itself isn't really there. You just have the linking verb, the verb of being, which is sort of like the fundamental verb after all. And it's such a powerful close, because it sort of makes you ask that question of like, so where is she at this point? Is she still in transit, so to speak? Is she somehow arrived at eternity? And what's it like there? And again, my question is still sort of like, is that different than the immortality that kind of accompanies her on the journey?
Right. And I will just say that there is a Dantistic precedent for this, in that at the end of his poem, at the end of his journey, he does come to paradise, to the beatific image. He does stand above the world in space, in heaven, and perceive the world through a different temporal framework. He perceives the world in the way that, say, heaven might perceive the world, rather than just a human. And so he sees it in this, with this grander scope, this teleological scope, like this musical symphony leading towards something, as the grand beatific image, which is literally what he does see. Something that takes shape, the great Trinity, the three circles. But we have this here with her as well. Centuries or a day, time, and how it passes changes up here, because we see the completion of all things. And so the poem completes with a sense of perfection, as in something has done and now has happened, and now we're reflecting on it. And so I guess I agree.
It's really tough. Like I like the comparison to the end of the Paradise. I get the sense that this is a much like that, sort of an ineffability hangs over this, of she's arrived at sort of the limits of what it's possible for her to tell us about this vision or experience or imagination of death, or whatever this is exactly, right? This journey with death accompanying you could just as easily be life instead, right? That you sort of always are in the company of death, and he's got no hurry, because you're gonna arrive there sooner or later, and that's times arrow as far as we're.
All right, well then that's precisely what I was thinking too. So just to mention, in the last stanza again, the horse's heads being towards eternity, that seems like a nod to, either conscious or non-consciously, to the Phaedrus, which is the image. They're the images of the two horses, the noble and the ignoble one, and the charioteer. And we've had that image of the carriage already here, leading towards eternity. A figure often in Plato's works is Socrates. He's generally the sort of protagonist. And a famous quote by him, written by Plato, of course, though, is that one should live, that philosophy is preparation for death. And so life is preparation for death. And so one should live in such a way as to have death be, sort of welcome at the end of it. And so it seems as if she's sort of admitting here also that that is the way she directed her soul and her being and her life towards being able to make that claim, that she took that trajectory in life.
I just missed a very small bit of that last part there. Can you say that?
Just that she was sort of admitting to taking that trajectory towards eternity during the course of her life, and that's sort of also the Socratic and early Platonic way of looking at how life should be lived too, so that one's death is the completion of one's life, the final chapter, the end, and then the story's over, and then you have a book, a complete story that then can be offered to somebody. And I do think that's the idea behind throwing mythological figures into the stars, that the Greeks sort of in narrative visual form there, imaginative form, got what I just said explicitly right. That to live an exemplary life makes you into a story worth telling, in either a negative way or a positive way. That's also what we were talking about when Dante in seminar today. So,
well, that's also something she wrote about in one of those poems about like Arcturus, right? And
right.
the star. Yeah, that's cool. So, shall we conclude here with this final suggested poem?
Yes, and then I guess we have to make our own admissions of having the wound and the pain of having to figure out the next American poet or writer to read as part of this course.
Yeah, I haven't given it terribly much thought, I have to confess.
We might have to hit a frost or two in the interim then.
Okay. That's true. He is a major, yeah, he's a major one that we could look at. All right, so here's a not admitting of the wound, 1188. A not admitting of the wound until it grew so wide that all my life had entered it, and there were troughs beside, a closing of the simple lid that opened to the sun, until the tender carpenter perpetual nail it down.
Okay, so there's so much Christian imagery in here that it's going to be hard to get through it all in a small amount of time. But the idea of a wound, or a wound that is not admitted to, the idea of original sin, a sin here, or something that expands out like a bad habit, like the relationship of Cain to Tubal Cain. There's something like Cain, if somebody kills him, 7 of their family members will be killed. But then when you get down to Tubal Cain, it's like 70 will be killed. And also it's a descendant of Cain who comes up with the weapons of war eventually that are used to kill people. So the idea seems to be that if you leave something unacknowledged, and I'll also bring up the what is it? What is that dragon book that Peterson always talks about? Not How to Train a Dragon, because that's the movie, but there's no such things as dragons or something like that. I can't believe I forgot the name.
Don't remember. Sorry. I know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah. In any case, the idea of there being a sort of natural wound to man, like sort of the pride of Lucifer or something like that, that if it goes unacknowledged, it gets larger and larger and larger, seems to be a very sort of Old Testament idea. Then sort of we get this major transition to Christian New Testament imagery. A closing of the simple lid, just an idea of a completion. And that, again, that sort of the vast or the cavernous or the gulfing gap between the first quatrain and then the Trinitarian triplet that we have after it. So we have something closing and ending at the beginning of something new, which is an opening to the sun. The sun is a traditional image of both Apollo and Christ as that which enlightens, in the idea of Apollo as attention and Christ as the logos, or the ability to rationally think as a human, which is the human's major adaptation to the world, which is the coming of the word of God from man, or from God to man, which is the coming of rationality and the ability to use one's conscious intellect as a human. And so we have that. Until the tender carpenter perpetual nail it down. Again, carpenter, she does often capitalize her nouns, life up there, carpenter here. Major Christian image here. So Jesus was a carpenter. He was nailed to a cross, which is an image for, human nature and divine nature being wedded together in violence and pain, because life is painful and you suffer precisely because you are conscious. And of course, the idea that Jesus' father was a carpenter, Joseph, but also his divine father, like Zeus for Heracles, who has a divine father. It's God, who is the great carpenter, and that he formed the earth, right? And so it's almost as if she has the Old Testament in a quatrain where Adam and Eve commit the initial act of sin, and things just get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then bang, out comes hope from Pandora's box in the form of Christianity and the Christian Savior. And just to tie that to the theme of death, it is precisely through his death that he redeemed man. And so it's almost as if she's suggesting that it might be a human's duty to die for something that they value, that they consider so important that it's worth dying for, because that is a guarantee that other people will see it as valuable, because that is giving that which is of highest value that you have for something that you must believe is of even higher value. And I wonder if that's what she thinks she's doing by giving us these poems as well.
This one is, I see like the way it's displayed here has a trip or a tercet in the second stanza, but I really feel like that could just as easily be a quatrain, which
Sure.
the second line of it has just been run together with the first line of it. And it's
Right.
interesting what that does to the look of the poem. It does distinguish the two stanzas much more sharply, having it displayed this way. And so I wonder, I mean, it does seem that that was intentional, because I think we can trust the curation of this, or at least we're implicitly sort of trusting the curators of this page to have kind of copied and transcribed these accurately as best they, the editors have been able to kind of discern. Anyway, though, I mean, I agree that there's a kind of duality to this one, and it's interesting too in the sense of the first one has a wideness and openness of it, and the second is all about the closing of that openness, right? And so it's like, what is the thing that's being closed? Is it the wound? Like, because that's one way that you could interpret it, I guess. But it certainly seems like the more likely candidate is this simple lid, like the eyelid is how I'm kind of hearing that, or of this, imagining this like, kind of box, which
Right.
you can think of as like the casket or the,
Yes.
the chest that held your life. Well, now it's time to close it, right? And the nesting of that carpenter noun between the two adjectives, or I'm not sure if perpetual could be an adverb too, like it's sort of doing double duty there. The tender carpenter perpetual, nail it down, or the tender carpenter perpetual, nail it down. Like, that's a weird and sort of ambiguous modifier there. I definitely hear the allusion to the cross, to the traditional stories of, and the traditional sort of interpretations. But I do think that she's definitely playing with those as well here. And I don't know quite what to make of, this life that she's sort of letting go of here, right? It's on the one hand, her maybe physical life. On the other hand, maybe it's her sort of spiritual, or her hope for an eternity that she's sort of letting it fall into some kind of wound. I think there's a lot of possible ways, even though the words are so simple. It's still a really complex poem. I wouldn't say I've quite nailed it down myself.
That's interesting. I wonder, I do see the tension between whether it is perpetually nail or a perpetual carpenter, especially if it is a carpenter perpetually nailing it down, because then it's a continual act into eternity, right? Which seems a little less final, though it is final in that it is the only thing that will ever happen. It is not final in that it is complete. Except in sort of a divine sort of way, and that if you consider one part of the action, part of the eternal action, if you perceive it teleologically, which perhaps that is how one is supposed to perceive a poem. But yeah, I like that you home in on life too, because life, just like in the Old Testament, the tree of life is precisely the tree that they did not eat from, Adam and Eve. They did eat from the tree of knowledge, and it's almost as if there's a tension between eternal life and knowledge, and that if you acquire knowledge and understand also through carnal knowledge the point of reproduction, you understand also your, the actuality of and the eventuality of your own death, and that to stay naive is the only thing that will save you from knowledge of your death and suffering. But well, at least in the second paragraph, it looks like that's not the way she ended up choosing it. It's like the coming of the sun, or the coming of the ability to reflect. It's made me think that perhaps the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament is like the coming of the moon after the sun, that there was so much activity in the beginning of time that now it's time to reflect on it all and to come to understand it. Perhaps that's what the age of science has been. And, well, looks like Miss Dickinson is part of that process as well.
Yeah, it's exciting to try to apply some more sophisticated maybe scientific approaches, right, to reading some of this stuff, I still am convinced that the most essential things about it, are to kind of read it out loud and
Yes.
bring it to life in that sense as well. That's yeah, and to kind of hold open as much as possible the various kinds of interpretation that we have been kind of having this give and take around. I like the idea of looking at Robert Frost next. That seems like a good move. I'm sure that we can find some good stuff on here to kind of orient us. I'm not super familiar with his work either. Like I've read some of it, but not a whole lot.
Neither am I. And if we ever want to guest on here, it might be worth a minute of our time to send an email to the Poetry Foundation webmasters and see if maybe we could ask them on and ask them what they think an ideal American poetry sort of unit or course would be, and perhaps we could take some of their pearls from them, and we could do our best not to be like to not be Margarita Nun or Margarita ante porcos. Pearls, swine before pearls, or pearls before swine there.
I've sent them a message through their little contact form, but that was just a day or two ago, so I haven't heard back yet, but I'm still hoping. And there's other kind of partners of theirs that maybe we can reach out to and stuff like that. So yeah, I imagine that we'll get a guest or two on here sooner or later.
All right. Well, and then I'm speaking of, for those listeners who listen to everything and just want the info, they don't have a particular subject matter, we will be broadcasting bright and early tomorrow. Wes, what time is it that we're going to be having side quests tomorrow?
If all goes well, it'll be 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which
very good.
Bright and early. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and I'll see you later tonight.
All right, sounds good.
All right,
get some rest. See ya.
You too.